Good morning, everybody. On behalf of St. Anthony's International Review, I would like to welcome you to the conference, The Internet, Power and Governance in a Digitized World, organized by St. Anthony's International Review in collaboration with the Oxford Internet Institute. I'm glad that so many of you have been able to take time off your busy schedules and joined us for what promises to be a timely and thought-provoking event. First, I'd like to start with thank yous and thank those people who have made organizing this conference possible. First of all, I'd like to thank St. Anthony's College for the funding that made organizing this conference possible in the first place. And in particular, I'd like to say thanks to Domestic Bursar Peter Robinson, Steward Anthony Squirrel, all the porters, and Development Director Emma Tracy. Secondly, I'd like to thank our partners at the Oxford Internet Institute, and in particular, William Dutton and Jonathan Zitrain. And last but not least, I would like to thank the whole STARE editorial team, particularly Managing Director Emily Padden, guest editor Shefali Virker, our former editor and co-founder of the journal, Matthew Eagleton-Pierce, and our PR officer, Lenny Wild. And before introducing our today's program and the themes we're going to explore today, I'd like to give a brief introduction to St. Anthony's International Review, or STARE. St. Anthony's International Review is a peer-reviewed academic journal established by graduate members of St. Anthony's College. It is published biannually, and it features articles on international affairs. The central aim of STARE is to reflect the cross-disciplinary dialogue on global issues of contemporary relevance, which is very much of a unique feature of St. Anthony's. And STARE, or St. Anthony's Review, seeks to develop a forum in which emerging scholars can publish their work alongside established academics and policymakers. We have published 3 issues so far, featuring topics such as international cooperation, human security, and international politics of oil. This year we have 2 issues coming out, namely democratization, which is due to be published in February, and an issue on the internet, which this conference is preparation for. And that issue is due to come out in May 2007. And I would like to remind you that we have a sales stand outside the Nissan Theatre, and you have a chance to buy all the back issues there, as well as order all the upcoming issues. Then I'd like to say a few words about the Oxford Internet Institute. The OII is a department within the Social Sciences Division of the University of Oxford, and it is one of the world's leading independent centers of excellence in academic research on the impact of the internet on society and informing policy and generating debate.
I have the great pleasure today of introducing Professor James Derian, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Professor James Derian is a Watson Institute Research Professor of International Studies at Brown University. Moreover, in January 2004, he became the director of the Institute's Global Security Program, in addition to directing the Information Technology War and Peace Project out of the Watson Institute. Oxford is in many ways James's old stomping ground, having been a Rhodes Scholar here at Oxford University, where he completed an MPhil and a DPhil supervised by Hedley Bull. He also returned to Oxford, and specifically to St. Anthony's, in 1995 as a visiting senior member. In addition to his time at Oxford, he's been a visiting scholar at the University of Southern California, MIT, Harvard, and the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton University. He's written several books, including On Diplomacy, A Genealogy of Western Estrangement, and Anti-Diplomacy, Spies, Terror, Speed, and War. And his most recent book is Virtuous War, Mapping the Military Industrial Media Entertainment Network. His articles on international relations have appeared in journals such as the Review of International Studies, International Affairs, and Millennium, and his articles on war, technology, and the media have appeared in the New York Times, Nation, Washington Quarterly, and Wired. For the past 20 years, James has been at the forefront of a discussion seeking to understand how information technology shapes both security and how we conceptualize security and international relations. The nation state, beset by new and unprecedented global forces, must grapple with a security or insecurity, which according to James is no longer definable by discrete levels of analysis, bounded disciplines of study, and fixed configurations of power. I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome James to St. Antony's, and we look forward to his talk.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back at St. Antony's, particularly be back at the behest of students. I think change comes slowly to institutions and disciplines, especially venerable ones like Oxford. And so I applaud your efforts, the St. Antony's International Review and the Oxford Internet Institute, for looking at the internet, looking for new approaches to the internet. And I'm very happy to be here because of this new effort. So I have to say also, I'm impressed by the organization. I came to my hotel room last night, and there was a packet waiting for me of all the papers. It's one of the first times I've come to a conference, and all the papers are there. I think I was supposed to read them all last night. And the terrible thing is I started to, and it was hard to stop. They're wonderful papers. I'm looking forward to them a great deal. But also worried me because I realized much of what I had to say was said better in many of the papers in greater detail. So instead of going through the use and abuse of the internet in a sort of empirical, detailed way about how it is, the accessibility, the inexpensiveness of it, the capability to coordinate terrorist attacks, the decentralized, deterritorialized nature of the internet that makes it so amenable to the latest outburst of terrorism in the 21st century, I instead have two sort of meditations. One's untimely, and the other, I hope, is slightly more timely. And the first untimely one, for the students, particularly my former students in the audience, you might have recognized it from, as we used to call him, Freddie Nietzsche, who wrote a wonderful essay in the 1870s. It was actually a series of essays under the title Untimely Meditations. Three of them were on a writer, David Strauss, a philosopher, Schopenhauer, and musician, composer, Richard Wagner. But the fourth, actually it was the third and the fourth series in 1873, was the use and abuse of history. Really, the better translation is the advantages and disadvantages of history in life. And he wrote this really as a response to Germany's victory, triumphalist moment over France. And it was something of a cautionary essay because he was looking at how history was being abused because at the time, of course, German historicism viewed the empire and history and German culture all going in lockstep towards, the Rechtsstaat, the state that was going to be the sort of paradigm for all future states and great powers. Now, Nietzsche, I want to just open up, because Nietzsche, ever the contrarian, I think what he has to say about the academic study of history gives us some lessons about the academic study of the internet. So I want us to step back for a moment and take a look at what we're attempting by this enterprise of turning the internet into a disciplinary object of scrutiny. And some of the questions that Nietzsche asks are really, I think, pertinent to ones we'll probably cover, I hope to cover, in this conference. Is history a tool of the powerful or the powerless? Does it traffic in information or knowledge? Does it inform or misinform? Has it enhanced our lives or become a substitute for it? Now, this is what Nietzsche had to say on the subject. He opens up the essay with a quote, actually, from Goethe. He says, "Incidentally, This is Goethe speaking. I despise everything which merely instructs me without increasing or immediately enlivening my activity. And he goes on to basically agree, because when history enervates, when it weakens us rather than strengthens us, because we lack what is still most essential to us, because what is superfluous is hostile to what is essential, is very much what happens, I think, often on the internet. We need, this is Nietzsche now, we need history for life and action, not for a comfortable turning away from life and action, or merely for glossing over the egotistical life and the cowardly bad act. We wish to use history only insofar as it serves living. But there is a degree of doing history and a valuing of it through which life atrophies and degenerates. To bring this phenomenon to light as a remarkable symptom of our time is every bit as necessary as it may be painful. So what I'd like to do today is something that Nietzsche in the Twilight of the Gods, Twilight of the Idols, he talks about the need for a symptomology, or as symptomology was then known, as semiotics. Because all too often, if we simply make moral judgments, the internet is good or bad, it really is just sort of a guise for really the power that underlies many of our academic studies. So semiotics, or a study of the symptoms of the internet, is something that I'd like to undertake. Because I think we do witness a similar tendency in some of these most unsettling, vicious and virtuous circles of the internet that were implicated, if not indicted, when we try to avoid too much of life and study too much, I think, of the virtues of the internet. I was struck, for instance, that one of the most obvious vices which have driven the internet is not a subject of this conference. The fact that pornography, which has really been the sort of the venture capital of the internet in many ways, and indeed has colonized like no other topic, it shows how this relationship between vice and virtue is always already happening on the internet. I think less obviously, but perhaps even more dangerously, we can see on the internet how an excess of virtue, Nietzsche uses this term, an excess of virtue, can really also possibly lead not to the ruin of the nation, as Nietzsche said, but the ruin of the internet. By an excess of virtue, thinking that we can just simply use the same forms of governance that we've used for governments themselves, states, or for corporations. The internet is a different beast. So when we start using language like global governance, I smell, as Nietzsche did, the smell of the swamp when people start talking about virtue in this regard. Now, I think Nietzsche would appreciate the irony that this relationship between vice and virtue is very often almost like a war. It's a game. It's like a series of offenses and defenses. And just to give you one example that probably many of you are familiar about in this room, just last week, the Citizen Lab, working with the Oxford Internet Institute, working with, I just gave you a credit here as you walked in, the Oxford Internet Institute, working with the Cambridge Security Group, the Berkman Center, unveiled a new software called Siphon. And what was this in reaction to? Well, countries, particularly repressive regimes, such as Saudi Arabia, Belarus, China, and others, of course, have used the anti-pornography software to basically screen religious, political, or other dissident messages from getting in. The idea that you can somehow form a border around the internet actually works when you can control servers. This, of course, is part of this game of offense-defense that the Citizen Lab, with hackers, with hacktivists rather, have created a software that will allow you to link home computers and other computers to use them as servers to get around these barriers. And so we see this sort of ongoing struggle around the internet. And why I started with Nietzsche and the untimely meditations of Nietzsche is because I think what's going on in the internet, more so than anything else, what drives it, is this will to power. It's a will to power, but it's also a searching for recognition that takes place on the internet and drives, I think, much of it. And the will to power, as Nietzsche teaches us, when it's repressed, thinking about these repressive regimes, can produce all kinds of pathologies. Nietzsche famously said that madness is rare among rare among individuals. It is common among nations. So the idea that we can sort of govern this collectively, that China, Belarus, and Saudi Arabia and other countries, we see these types of pathologies. And I think Nietzsche would celebrate the efforts of Citizen Lab, the OII, and the Cambridge Security Group to identify and counter these repressive regimes seeking to restrict access. Now, I invoke Nietzsche then as a deterrent here at this talk against what I see to be a potential and even ongoing devitalization of the internet. Nietzsche says of history, the use and abuse of history, it's when it strips life of contingency and choice. And I think the internet is all about contingency and choice. So what Nietzsche has to say about real life, I think, applies to the artificial life on the web. Both invoke a contest of wills, a desire for recognition. But we shouldn't reduce simply, the will to power to the lust for power. It's, again, when it's repressed, we can see it having this reactive, resentful longing for only power, and the triumph of nihilism that Nietzsche warns against. So I'm really advocating, as Nietzsche does, this affirmation of freedom on the internet, where the will to power is an active affirmative force which challenges all values, all imposed values. It pits individuals then against themselves, not against others in acts of self-overcoming rather than trying to overcome the practices on the internet and the way that global governance speaks. I think the calls for global governance of the internet should be met with the same suspicion that Nietzsche reserved for what he called the will to a system. Such systems might promise edification and protection, but they end up corrupting life because they really seek mastery over others, not this self-overcoming mastery over oneself. In the discourse of governance, the will to power is subordinated to the need for security, but in the process produces a collective resentment of others because others represent threats. They are agents of uncertainty. This, in turn, triggers further insecurities. We all know about the security dilemma, and real security as networks increasingly connect nations only comes when one recognizes and, I think, learns to live with this new global multitude that the internet represents and the insecurity of all universal values. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to lead to sort of the anxiety that many identify with Nietzsche of anything goes. Rather, there is operating with this sort of replicative processes of the internet, something like the eternal recurrence. In Nietzsche, there is an ethics. The idea is that every choice you make is going to come back and meet you again. Well, on the net, that's very, very true. The eternal recurrence is that every decision, every choice, small or large, I'm going to have to watch this talk again and again and again on the web. It's going to be horrible. And so I better get it right. So this is, I think, where I think there is an ethics operating in this visibility, transparency, and indeed repetition that the web represents. Now, at the core of Western metaphysics, and this is Derrida's point, is a desire, an ongoing desire to secure, re-secure the center of power. From God to the emperor, from the Pope to the king, from the king to the people, from revelation to reason. There's always been an attempt to re-secure this metaphysical center, and it's been very difficult to find that foundation in the internet, and I think it's frustrating some people. I think the internet has no center to hold or replace, and rather than as a utopian vision pretend we can do this through global governance, I think like Nietzsche, we need to return to the Greeks. In the very last passage of the use and abuse of history, he finds an alternative path for finding some kind of unity in this new diversity. And this is again Nietzsche, and I promise this will be my last quote from Nietzsche. There were centuries when the Greeks found themselves in a danger similar to the one in which we find ourselves. That is, the danger of destruction from being swamped by what is foreign and past from, in quote, history. The Greeks never lived in proud isolation. Their culture, again in quotes, was for a long time much more a chaos of foreign, Semitic, Babylonian, Lydian, Egyptian forms and ideas, and their religion, a real divine struggle of the entire Orient, something similar to the way German culture and religion are now a self-struggling chaos of all foreign lands and all prehistory. Nevertheless, Hellenic culture did not become an aggregate. And the Greeks learned gradually to organize the chaos because, in accordance with the Delphic reading, they directed their thoughts back to themselves, that is, to their real needs, and let the apparent needs die off. So they seized possession of themselves again. Now, on the global scale of the internet, one could argue the stakes are even higher today than when Nietzsche was offering these untimely meditations. Networked information technology has come to dominate our very image of being, our way of being in the world. It would, however, I think, be ahistorical to pretend this begins with the internet. Rather, it has become, I think, the internet itself has become the most integrated and ubiquitous form of, among a host of others, of new information technologies. We could include, of course, radio, film, cinema, iPods, cell phones, but in the way in which they are linked through the internet, I think it's a case in which technology and topicality are meshing in hitherto in ways we've never witnessed before. I think as the medium and the message become entwined, it is terror, which is now the central concern of the most powerful concern in this regard on the internet, and what I want to turn to today. I think we are in a disturbingly familiar time, and why, at one hand, I'm going to offer you an untimely meditation and a timely meditation, is because I think we're returning to a shift, a transformation, something equivalent, and I'm not going to say we're living in fascist times, but we are living in an interwar. A permanent war, global war on terror, as some call it in the United States. But it's really an interwar in the sense that Walter Benjamin, I think, first commented on this, where he was witnessing the rise of a new technology of representation, in fact, of radio and cinema, and how it could be applied to all kinds of political, not just applied, but actually help further magnify political pathologies. And something that Benjamin said, and I repeat because I think it's even truer now, is that history no longer decays into stories. It decays into images. So really what's also new about the internet is how we have a new fluency of images with political impact. And I'm going to be talking about that in a minute, particularly jihadist videos. But he also said that in times of terror, this is Benjamin speaking, in times of terror, when everyone is something of a conspirator, everybody will be in a situation where he has to play detective. So once again, the onus becomes placed on the individual. How do you develop the skills, the fluency, but also the media literacy to read these images in the way that people once read stories? Now, playing I think the detective here is made all the more difficult by the slipperiness of the term terror. I mean, terror isn't simply a word that's abused. It's an abuse itself. It's a banality. It's a bleached out word. And yet, it gets thrown around all the time. And it's typically understood as an act of symbolically intimidating and, if deemed necessary, violently eradicating another. It can be a radically differentiated other through religion, culture, politics. But it is, in a sort of catch-all political signifier, a way, obviously, of tagging our enemies. Unfortunately, and if we not only tend, but I insist that we use history, we all know too well how the terrorist can become the freedom fighter, the terrorist can become a state leader, in a matter of time. Even bin Laden the Good, when he was part of the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet occupiers, contrasted to bin Laden the Bad, after al-Qaeda has toppled the Twin Towers and crashed into the Pentagon. That really, terrorism has morphed into what I call the political pornography of modernity. We know it when we see it, and it is everywhere. It is ubiquitous like the internet. And this is why I coined this term infoterror, about how the two feed off each other, how in the age of Photoshop, making the image ever more malleable, as jihadist websites multiply monthly, weekly, even daily. At the beginning of 9/11, there was one Al-Qaeda website. Now there's over 1,000. By the latest count, the number of websites connected to terrorist groups is close to 5,000. So it is a phenomenon, one that we have to treat seriously, but also the forms of anti-terror and counter-terror, the way in which Hollywood, Washington, D.C., Silicon Valley have all come together in a new convergence of power and knowledge that warrants this new tag, I think, of living in an age of infoterror. Now, just as the invention of scientific genocide and the management of a nuclear balance of terror in the form of nuclear weapons, I think became the key issues of the 20th century. How do you manage those issues? I think so too in the 21st century, this new nexus of terror, information, and technology is going to become the most pressing question of the 21st century. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're here today. Now, I'd like to turn to my second, I hope, timelier meditation. Initially, when I put this together, I was figuring I'm going to have two untimely meditations because it starts with someone who got canned by President Bush in the process of putting this talk together. But now he's returned with a vengeance. Donald Rumsfeld's like the undead. You can't kill this guy. He just keeps coming back. He released a memo just a few days ago where, right before he was fired, evidently, he was saying, things aren't going well in Iraq. We have to change course. And it was a fascinating memo, leaked, I'm sure, by friends, if not Rumsfeld himself, to the New York Times. But the second meditation here is really aimed at several issues, particularly anybody who might doubt that the ubiquitous media and ubiquitous terror of the internet aren't transforming the ways that war and peace are made or unmade, but also how they are impacting our way of being. And Donald Rumsfeld last February made a rare trip to the Council on Foreign Relations. And in this presentation, he spoke, and he opens with an anonymous talk. And I'm sorry, Emily, to make you stand all this time. Up there. And you just click right on here. This is the first of the clips.
Consider this statement, quote, "More than half of this battle is taking place in the battlefield of the media. We are in a media battle, in a race for the hearts and minds of millions," unquote. The speaker was not some modern-day image consultant in a public relations firm here in New York City. It was Osama bin Laden's chief lieutenant, Ayman al-Zawahiri.
I can go right to the next clip.
Today we're engaged in the first war in history, unconventional and irregular as it may be, in an era of emails, blogs, cell phones, Blackberries, instant messaging, digital cameras, a global internet with no inhibitions, cell phones, handheld video cameras, talk radio, 24-hour news broadcasts, satellite television. There's never been a war fought in this environment before.
Now, it's interesting. We'll skip over the length of the speech and go right to the next clip. He claims, and he provides evidence, that the United States is losing this war. It's asymmetrical warfare. And in spite of all the resources, we have this new global condition in which the United States no longer can exercise hegemony over all the battlefields of this global war on terror.
I want to talk today about something that at first might seem obvious, but it really isn't obvious. Our enemies have skillfully adapted to fighting wars in today's media age, but for the most part, we, our country, our government, has not adapted. Consider that the violent extremists have established media relations committees. These are terrorists. And they have media relations committees that meet and talk about strategy, not with bullets, but with words. They've proven to be highly successful at manipulating the opinion elites of the world. They plan and design their headline-grabbing attacks using every means of communication to intimidate and break the collective wills of free people. Go ahead and answer the phone. What the heck?
I guess a phone rang in the audience somewhere. maybe I'll show the final clip now because that sets this up. Go ahead, show the final clip.
They know that communications transcend borders and that a single news story handled skillfully can be as damaging to our cause and helpful to theirs as any other method of military attack. And they're doing it. They're able to act quickly. They have relatively few people. They have modest resources compared to the vast and expensive bureaucracies of Western governments. Our federal government is really only beginning to adapt our operations to the 21st century. For the most part, the U.S. government still functions as a five and dime store in an eBay world.
A five and dime store in an eBay world. I love it when Donald Rumsfeld talks dirty. He talks about eBay. He was obviously influenced by what's called the revolution in military affairs. He's brought in individuals who have been trying to transform the military, and this gave him an opportunity to bring the two together in this talk. But he's not, I think, engaging in too much hyperbole here. The New York Times has run a series of articles about Al-Qaeda's media production division called El Sahab that produces videos that migrate from these jihadist websites that can be shut down fairly quickly, but the proliferation is so rapid. And indeed, you can go to YouTube now and probably pull down as many of these videos from YouTube as you could from the much more difficult sites to reach and to find on the net. They're migrating to all kinds of video sharing sites, Google Video, another. And I'm not going to go into the details about how jihadists have used the internet in other ways because they are in the papers to follow. But it's, I think, fair to say, Rumsfeld's getting this right, but he's getting it right for the wrong reason. And his idea of what to do next is, I think, even as we see, for instance, with the Patriot 2 Act, perhaps a case where the response will be more dangerous than the initial attack. I have other examples, but you're probably familiar with him. The Zarqawi videotape before he was found and killed, him firing off a variety of weapons. Then the DOD deciding to engage in a little counter media tactics shows the outtakes where Zarqawi's gun jams. I don't know how they got hold of these outtakes. And Zarqawi's dumbfounded what to do. And pictures of them zooming in on his really sort of hokey-looking sneakers he was wearing underneath his robes. So this media war goes on, and it goes on the internet in almost a loop fashion. There's numerous other examples. Probably the one you're very familiar with. I think there was an individual here whose nickname was Irhabi 007. Do you remember him? He was seized, I think, last October. His name was Zulis. He was basically setting up a virtual jihadist training camp, and the British authorities seized him and his computer. Irhabi, by the way, in Arabic means terrorist, 007 terrorist. He was evidently also providing all types of information on bomb making. So this is, I think, again, a case where there is a new balance of power and truth that's shifting in the way that once, when Nietzsche used to talk about the balance of power among nations, and here in this case, it's shifting this balance of power and truth on a new configuration. And in the term I've used to coin this is hetero polarity. I don't think it's ever going to make the Foreign Affairs Journal. The idea of we're living in a heteropolar world as opposed to a unipolar. I think the unipolar moment passed almost in a blink of an eye. It certainly has passed since the United States sent troops to Iraq. We're not living in a multipolar world because multipolar suggests that there are relatively homogeneous actors in an array or in a balance. I think we're in a heteropolar because what you have are these differentiated actors. There are differences in scale, of course. When you can have, Al-Qaeda, 19 individuals, using the internet to plan this event. Famously, the Al-Qaeda operatives would only stay in hotels with Ethernet, or motels. They bought their tickets online. They used chat rooms. They planned through email. You could say that this event would not have happened without the internet, or at least not as smoothly and perhaps as successfully. And it's equally true to say the inability of the Pentagon and the FBI and the CIA to do their own computer work to connect the dots is evidence of the failure, in this case, of them to keep up with the advances, this new heteropolarity. In a heteropolarity, you have different actors, different scales, but super empowered by media, super empowered by the internet, that allows them to be players and to reconfigure the balance of power. And that's why I wanted to give you a sense of this through the words of Donald Rumsfeld. Now, in The Use and Abuse of History, Nietzsche warned against the kind of monumental history that would bury the living with the dead. And one of the tasks, I think, of us and of what we're trying to do at the Watson Institute and the Global Security Program, the Global Media Project, is to get beyond 9/11. Because the dead, I'm afraid, as much as we need to honor those dead, have buried the living. And I think infoterror, which plagues us today, is a symptom of this. And it's interesting. Nietzsche thinks we can find the cure in the poison. The Greeks had a word for this, pharmakon, where the cure can be the poison the cure, as long as it's not, I guess, polonium-210. Life, this is Nietzsche, is ailing from many ills. Not only does it suffer from the memory of its fetters, it suffers from what is here our principal concern, from the historical sickness. It knows the juices for wounds and the medicine to combat the historical sickness, to combat the excess of the historical. What are they called? Now, people should not be surprised. They are the same. They are the names of poisons. The antidotes against the historical are called the unhistorical and the superhistorical. Now, by the unhistorical, he's talking about the power of forgetting that was taken up by various writers in the period of the Cold War. The power of forgetting, to forget the repressions of the past, to forget the weight of the dead. The superhistorical is to try to find the exemplars, the exemplary acts, the exemplary figures who can take us out of this current historical feedback loop of terror and anti-terror. Because what we're really locked in, I believe, is something like an act of mimesis, another Greek word of imitative acts, and the way that Bush and bin Laden got caught in a mimetic relationship early on, where each needs the other for their own identity. And this othering that goes on in this process is really, I think, fueled in the infoterror that I talk about, and of violence, counter-violence, terror, and counter-terror, that the prophecies and fear of hatred take on a self-fulfilling power through this mimesis. So we really have to engage in, I think, unhistorical, superhistorical acts. And it's important that mimesis is understood not simply as an act of recognition, but mimesis, if you go to a medical dictionary, and we're back to the idea of poison and cure, mimesis is identified, I quote, the appearance, often caused by hysteria, of symptoms of a disease not actually present. Now, historically, terrorism evolves into states, or if they don't have a mass base, they usually just weaken, rarely last longer than a decade. That's the history. Empires inevitably will overreach and fail. Now, in this particular mimetic struggle, we have clashing fundamentalisms, magnified by the media, and primarily, I would argue, by the internet, that are fought by asymmetrical technologies of destruction. Now, if unchecked, they are able to develop their own logic. Mimesis, like Clausewitz talked about war, if unchecked by politics, will tend towards total war. And I think we've witnessed this with the first administration of this, the Bush administration, and the second as well. So we have this peculiar state of affairs of symptoms of a disease not actually present, producing even worse pathologies. Now, the pharmacon that I've spoken about here is really the idea that you've created, to stick with this medical metaphor for a moment, an autoimmune response, where the initial catalyst has produced a worse reaction in the host body. And in this autoimmune response, I think you have all kinds of hysterias. And it's a case where this internally generated disease and an autoimmune response of counterterrorism that is in some ways perpetuating, I think, the myth that the sovereign state is going to protect us, take care of us, cure this condition of infoterror. It won't. It's going to happen through the individual actions of people making up the hetero polarity that I speak of. If anything, the internet as the most deterritorialized, decentralized platform that probably has ever been witnessed on this scale, this global scale, that this nation state cannot do this. Global governance cannot do this. I think there's a confusion between cause and effect, between disease and symptom, and we need to look at how there has to be another way out. And that's how I'd like to end, with not one but three endings. I want to justify having Emily stand up here this whole time by quickly just going through a few slides to identify the terror and counterterror that's operated on the internet. How much more time would you say about? Okay. Go through these quickly then. Some of this is what Donald Rumsfeld was talking about. There's now 4,000. We'll just go through these quickly, Emily. You've all heard about how the internet's been used in various fashions in steganography, embedding information in images. Carry on. Using Skype and VoiceOver to avoid detection. A lot of this is covered in the papers, so we'll just quickly stream through this. The anonymity, using chat rooms, but also some examples of how Juba the Sniper, this is one of the most amazing sets of videos. If you go to Site, S-I-T-E, or even YouTube, you can find some of these, on how you see the increasing production values, the sophistication of these series of videos of this one sniper. It might be actually a composite figure. And increasingly, the videos spreading across various websites. Carry on. And yeah, get the idea here. It's interesting, too, how chat rooms are being used. Take a look at this. Yahoo Group, a very popular site for jihadists. And they very kindly offer us English subtitles. Carry on. Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera International just recently opened in the States, but they're having a hard time getting on cable. But I was quite impressed. They came and covered our global media project, and they're doing short documentaries. If you're interested on the use of the internet, they're sort of turning the camera back on themselves. Al Jazeera International are going to be, I think there's going to be 3 short documentaries on this coming up over the next 3 months. Now, counterterrorism, we've spoken about briefly. Excellent site for getting most of this information for those who are doing research in this area. And I also highly recommend the work of Paul Pillar, who's deputy head of the Center for Counterterrorism for many years and now is a professor of political science at Georgetown. He's been doing work on this area too. Carry on, please. Yeah. Some people don't realize this, but it was the internet that was used to lure David Pearl to his interview. It was a spurious email from a source. He went to meet the source, and we all know what happened after that. I'm just going to let you cycle through these if you want, because I'd like to end, because I'm really looking forward to the discussion period here. I had trouble finding an ending to this talk because of the nature of the untimely and timely meditations. So I decided to give you, pretend we've already moved past the presentation to the DVD, where you have like alternative endings. So I have 3 alternative endings. The first is something that happened when I was invited by the State Department to go to the first international conference on terrorism in Brazil. It was just last August. It was David Kennedy from the Harvard Law School, whose book I highly recommend on law and of war and, what's it called? Law of War and Peace. And Martha Crenshaw, who's done wonderful historical examinations of terror. And, but when we got to Rio, and it was picked up to tell you how terror can be infused in various ways, picked up in an armored Chevy Suburban because the day before some gangs had hijacked their other passengers coming from the airport from the State Department. The radio communication with the embassy, I was listening in, was all about a scandal, not a scandal, but really a media spasm that had been triggered because the state legislature had once again brought up the issue of the U.S. invasion of Brazil. How many people know about the planned U.S. invasion of Brazil? I'm curious. Good, okay. I didn't know about it. So they were dealing with this crisis, and it turns out it was a crisis spawned by the internet. Now, many, many years ago, Herman Kahn, the guy who sort of gave us the figure of Dr. Strangelove, writing on the nuclear balance of terror, talked about the need to invade Brazil because, of course, rubber plantations. And there was textbooks that would bring this up year and year. But now, a rumor had started originally on the internet and had grown and grown and grown that the U.S. was about to invade Brazil because it needed the Amazon basin. It needed it for its resources because, obviously, Brazilian government as caretakers was not doing a sufficient job of maintaining this global resource. And it reached such a point, and everybody wanted to talk about it, so I decided to diffuse it. And I opened my talk by saying there is no plan by this administration to invade Brazil. But if Al Gore is elected, he will. And I said it in facetious style, and the next thing you know, the internet all over Rio, Al Gore plans to invade and then I became part of the scandal, and I just realized how you can't control the message. You just cannot. So this idea of global governance, I just always find it somewhat fanciful. The second ending happened, I was really inspired by something that happened roughly a couple months before that. We're doing a documentary as part of the Global Media Project called The Culture of War. And we're basically following the 1st Battalion of the 25th Marines, which is a New England reservist group that was over in Al Anbar province, one of the most dangerous places in the world right now in Iraq. And we embedded, myself and a small crew, embedded with them at 29 Palms because they were spending 6 weeks there to learn how to be culturally sensitive. This is a new project where every soldier, every Marine has to go through cultural awareness training. And we followed them for a week, and then they went off to Al Anbar province, and we were in communications with them using internet, instant messaging. And then when they came back, we did interviews. But one moment's really sort of hit home. My handler at the time was a guy named Gunnery Sergeant Waltz, and he kept insisting that I had to meet the pigman. And so I said, okay. And so we drive up through the desert. This is in the high Mojave Desert to this forward operating base. We slept, and we didn't sleep. Well, we did kind of sleep with them. We slept, ate with the soldiers, the Marines, out at 29 Palms. And we found this guy, and he's a corpsman, all Navy medics are called, or marine medics are called corpsmen. And the pigman described to me why he was the most popular guy in the squad, and that's because they progressively torture a pig to see how to keep it alive. First they shoot it with a 9mm, then they shoot it with an AK-47, then they burn it, smoke inhalation, and whoever keeps the pig alive the longest gets a special certificate. And everybody in the squad loves these guys because if they're going to be wounded in this war, you want someone who can quickly deal with the severity of these new wounds. And this corpsman in particular was good. He kept his pig alive for 12 hours. And I was completely, watching the mayhem of war from a distance is always an act of removal, a virtualization, a numbness, because you see the same image over and over again. But the war at that moment just really came home to me, and something about it made me go back to this idea of a symptomology. What was this a symptom of? And it's interesting because semiology, which was synonymous with symptomology, this word first appears in the 17th century. It's when medicine and war, medicine and the military were developing new arts based on science of observation and trying to understand this new, really form of almost scientific warfare that Clausewitz later became famous for. And in medicine, the idea of observation. How do you study the signs? And semiology then was the study of symptoms, but in the military, it was a sign of new visual signaling because the battlefield had sort of grown and it could no longer do communications by simply sending runners or shouting. And so both the military and the medicine fields developed this symptomology, the study of signs. And in the respective theaters of operations, I began to think about how you would undertake a semiology of some of the worst effects of the internet. And I realized that one of the worst effects is the disappearance of the body. In the way that Virilio talks about this aestheticization of war and the disappearance, how do you bring the body back in without falling prey to the prurience of showing the beheading that the jihadists do, or the numbing from the repetitive images. And this left me in a real quandary about what to do, how to respond to the virtualization of warfare and the virtualization of terror that takes place on the internet. So I think the internet has to value life. I don't think we should confuse the symptoms for the disease. I think the war machine is always going to be more powerful than the internet machine. I think the age of infoterror is devaluing life and disappearing the body. And it's something I hope we can talk about in the discussion to follow. Thank you very much.